In this video, we'll create an accessible focal point picker, which lets users choose the most important part of your image, so that the image still looks great whatever size you crop it down to. Hey guys, and welcome to Azure Coding. To get started, I've set up some basic HTML and CSS, which will allow us to both attach the focal point picker to an image and display the image cropped down to portrait and square orientations to see it in action. We'll create a focal point picker library in this focal.js file, and we'll then use a few lines of code to apply it to our image element. All the code is available from the link in the description down below. I'll be writing the focal point picker library in JavaScript today, but there's a TypeScript version available from the link as well. So let's start by setting up our library in the focal.js file. I set up a focal point picker class with a constructor here, so that when we apply it to an image element, all we need to do is write new focal point picker and specify the image element, change event handler, and optional default starting point. In the constructor, we can start by declaring the HTML elements we'll need, including the image element argument. Then we can set up the focal point position to either the argument value if it's there, or the center of the image, and I'll create a helper function up here to return the center focal point with the relevant x and y values. And then we can set an onChange variable with the value from the argument of the same name, or if one's not being provided, we'll just use an empty function. Following that is an isDragon boolean value that we'll use later, and an original next sibling variable that we'll need when we want to dispose the focal point picker and return the image back to its original state. I've set up some event handlers down below, and so we can use the bind function to store a reference to those functions, so that we can set them up and dispose them later on. But let's work on the styles for the focal point picker beforehand. The container will act as a wrapper for the image element, and the pointer will be a red semi-transparent circle. Feel free to style this as you like. I'm also going to add in a crosshair, which is essentially a horizontal and vertical line down the middle of the image as a reference point, but this isn't necessarily needed for the functionality. We'll now place the image element in a container using the insertBefore function on the image's parent, and then add all the child elements into the container, including the image element. And next we'll use the setUpEventListeners function to register the event handlers. And we'll use the updatePointerPosition function to set the position of the red pointer element as an x and y percentage like so. Back in the constructor, we'll call these three functions. Down below, I've created a getFocalPoint function that we can use in the UI to retrieve the current focal point position. And there's also a setFocalPoint function that sets the focal point variable, updates the pointer element, and calls the onChange function that was passed as an argument in the constructor. I've also got a dispose function here as well, in case we need to revert the image element back to its original state without the focal pointer on it. All this is essentially doing is removing the surrounding container, pointer, etc., removing the event listeners, and reverting all values back to their defaults. We just need to set up the event handlers now. When the user clicks the image, we want to set the focal point to wherever they clicked. To get the size and position of the image element, we can use getBoundingClientRect, and then we can make use of this when setting the focal point using the function we saw earlier. If we consider the x-coordinate first by looking at this diagram, we want to know how far into the image the cursor is, and this is indicated in a diagram by the star. We can get this value by looking at the distance the image is from the left of the viewport and subtracting that from the cursor's x-coordinate. If we substitute these values with example numbers, that might make things clearer. All we need to do afterwards is divide our star value, 15 in this case, by the width of the image to get a percentage value between 0 and 1. We'll do the same for the y-coordinate, but this time we'll use the top of the image and the height instead. Next is the handleDragStart function that gets called when the user starts dragging the pointer. For this, we'll just set isDragon to true, making sure to call event.preventDefault, because we don't want to select the content on the page when we're dragging the pointer around. For handleDragMove, which gets called when the pointer is being dragged across the image, we'll first make sure isDragon is true, and then we'll set the focal point as we did in the clickEvent handler, except this time we'll want to cap the x and y values to a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1, otherwise the pointer might float outside the image. And lastly, for handleDragEnd, we'll just set isDragon to false. Now that we've created the library, let's apply it to an image and see it in action. I've added a script to our HTML file, and in it I've defined some constants for the image elements, the two div elements that we'll use to display the image as a background, positioned according to the selected focal point, and a reset button to put the focal pointer back into the center. Let's start by declaring our change event handler for when the focal point is moved to a different position. We'll be passing the new position in an argument, and so we'll make use of this to get the x and y values as percentages. Let's console log this for now. Now we just need to create a focal point picker like so, passing in the image element and the callback above. Let's test it out. So as you can see, I'm moving the pointer about, and we'll successfully get messages in the console. Now we'll just need to update these two background images to respect the focal point. I'll replace this console log with a for loop on the two div elements, setting the background position of each one accordingly. And now when we move the pointer, the background images move towards the focal point. Moving in the Y direction doesn't seem to have much effect on the background images because all I've essentially done is shrink the width of the image to a square or portrait orientation. But if I set background size to auto here, we should be able to see the Y coordinate in action as well. We also defined the third parameter for a default starting point, so let's try that out. And I'll also console log the result of the getFocalPoint function to see if that's working too. And as expected, the focal pointer is starting in its new position, and that position has been output to the console. Let's remove this default value and take a look at the reset button next. We'll add in a click event handler here and set the focal point to the center. We can use the getCenterFocalPoint function we defined in our library to help out with this. Now when I move the pointer and click reset, the pointer returns to the center, and while we're here I'll test out the dispose function. And that's cleared the pointer and crosshair, returning the image back to what it was originally. But if some users use the keyboard instead of the mouse, they won't be able to adjust the pointer, so let's now explore how we can make this focal point picker accessible. The user should be able to tab into the pointer and use the arrow keys to move it about. Every time the user presses an arrow key while focused on the pointer will move 1% in the appropriate direction, and so we'll define that step size at 1% here. We'll need a key down event handler, so we'll assign the value of the bound function here. Register the event handler in setup event listeners, and dispose a handler in the dispose function. In this key down event handler, we'll get the new focal point position as an X and Y value, and then we'll use a switch statement to see which arrow key was pressed. If it was the left arrow key, we'll subtract 1% from the current X coordinate, making sure this doesn't pass 0. For the right arrow key, we'll want to add 1% and make sure it doesn't pass 1. And then for the up and down arrow keys, we'll do the same but for the new Y variable this time. We'll then use event.preventDefault again and set the focal point with our helper function. It's also a good idea to include ARIA attributes which give additional context to screen readers about what's going on in the page. I created a function down here especially for this. Firstly, we'll format the X and Y values into percentages and display them as a readable string value. The ARIA value now attribute will be best used in this case to let the screen reader know what the X and Y values are, but this attribute only accepts one number. To get around this, we can just favour the X coordinate and then use ARIA value text, which allows us to provide additional information about the value as a string. ARIA value text will be called out by the screen reader, but it's good practice to have ARIA value now there as well. We can also add a title attribute as well, which will appear as a tooltip on desktop devices. We'll need to call this update ARIA values function in set focal point below, and also in the set of styles function, which gets called on initialization. Here we'll also set tab index to 0 so the user can tab into the pointer, and we can set the role attribute to slider and ARIA label to focal point so the screen reader can announce what it is. Let's test it out using the keyboard. And as you can see, I'm able to tab into the focal pointer and I'm using the arrow keys to move it about the image. If you're looking for some example apps, I've created a suite of desktop and Android apps that are all open source, and I've also made a language learning site built with Eleventy that's 100% free. Check them both out in the description down below. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to keep up to date with the latest from Azure coding. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.